Hold it steady when I lift. Buy yourself a hot meal instead.
The rain had started before dawn and had never fully stopped, turning the gravel lot behind Dawson's farm supply into a patchwork of muddy puddles and slick tire tracks that reflected the gray Montana sky like broken pieces of glass. Most people hurried through the weather with their collars up and their eyes down, focused on getting what they needed and getting back to the warmth of their trucks before the cold soaked through their clothes. Near the far fence, half hidden behind a stack of feed pallets, an old travel trailer leaned at an awkward angle, one wheel sunk deep into the mud. A bent jack stand lay beside it, and a thin man in a faded army jacket was struggling to lift the trailer hitch high enough to slide a replacement support underneath. Each time he strained upward, the trailer shifted slightly and threatened to slip again, and each time the few customers who noticed him looked away almost immediately, pretending not to see the problem because stopping to help would mean getting wet, dirty, and delayed. Ethan Cole noticed him because Ethan noticed things other people ignored. At 39, he had spent the last 6 years raising his 10-year-old daughter Lily alone after losing his wife, Rachel, to a sudden illness that had shattered the life they had been building together. Since then, Ethan had learned to keep moving forward one ordinary day at a time. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, fixed transmissions, changed brakes, patched rusted exhaust systems, and came home each evening to help Lily with homework, cook simple dinners, and listen to her talk about school as though those routines were the stitches holding their little family together. He was not the kind of man who thought of himself as heroic, he simply had a hard time walking past someone who was struggling. Setting down the box of spark plugs he had just purchased, Ethan crossed the lot without saying a word and crouched beside the old man. Up close he could see the veteran's hands shaking from exhaustion and cold, the deep lines weathered into his face, and the military tattoo faded almost blue against his wrist. "Hold it steady when I lift," Ethan said quietly, already positioning himself beneath the hitch. Together they worked in the rain for nearly 40 minutes, their boots sinking into the mud as they improvised a repair using a length of chain, a spare bolt from Ethan's truck, and a heavy wooden block scavenged from behind the warehouse. The old man introduced himself only as Frank, and he spoke little beyond the occasional warning when the trailer shifted or a grateful grunt when a stubborn bolt finally came loose. By the time the support was secured and the trailer stood level again, both men were soaked through and streaked with mud from their knees to their elbows. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, offering Ethan a few folded bills with obvious embarrassment, but Ethan shook his head immediately. "Buy yourself a hot meal instead," he said, wiping rainwater from his forehead. Frank studied him for a long moment with eyes that seemed much sharper than the rest of him, as though he were trying to understand why a stranger would spend nearly an hour in the cold helping someone who had nothing to offer in return. Ethan only gave a small shrug, picked up his parts, and headed back toward his truck, already thinking about the brake job waiting for him at the garage and whether Lily would remember that tonight was spaghetti night. Behind him, the veteran remained standing beside the repaired trailer, watching Ethan drive away through the rain with an expression that looked less like gratitude and more like someone who had just recognized a face from a memory he could not quite place. Ethan had almost forgotten about the veteran by the next morning. The repair shop was already busy before 8 o'clock, the familiar smell of motor oil, coffee, and damp concrete filling the air while Lily sat at the small desk in the corner finishing a science worksheet before school. A customer's pickup truck was up on the lift with its front axle disassembled when the low hum of an expensive engine rolled slowly down the street, drawing the attention of nearly everyone nearby. Through the open garage door, Ethan saw a long black SUV glide to a stop in front of the shop, its polished surface reflecting the morning sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds after 2 days of rain. Vehicles like that did not come to his part of town. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, and even the mail carrier slowed his route to watch. A woman in a dark coat stepped out of the passenger side, followed by a driver in a charcoal suit who opened an umbrella over her even though the rain had already stopped. She looked to be in her mid-30s, tall, composed, and unmistakably out of place among the rusted trucks and weathered storefronts that lined Maple Street. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and walked forward, assuming she was lost or looking for a dealership on the highway. Instead, she stopped directly in front of him and asked, "Are you Ethan Cole?" When he nodded, she introduced herself as Caroline Bennett and explained that her father had asked her to find him personally. Ethan frowned, confused, until she added a detail that made him pause. Her father was the veteran with the broken trailer from the farm supply lot. Before Ethan could ask how that was possible, the rear door of the SUV opened and Frank stepped out, though he looked surprisingly different in the daylight. The old army jacket was gone, replaced by a clean wool coat, and while he still carried himself with the slight stiffness of age, there was nothing uncertain about the way he walked toward Ethan. Frank smiled warmly and admitted that he owed him an apology for not being completely honest the day before. Over coffee at a diner across the street, he explained that he was not homeless at all. He had served in the Army for 22 years and later founded Bennett Logistics, a transportation company that had grown into one of the largest freight operations in the Northwest. The old trailer, he said with a faint laugh, was part of a restoration project he kept on a piece of land outside town, and he often drove it himself because it reminded him of the years before business success had complicated everything. Caroline listened quietly while her father spoke, though Ethan noticed the cautious way she watched him, as if she were trying to decide whether his kindness had truly been as spontaneous as Frank believed. Frank then made a request that caught Ethan completely off guard. He wanted him to come to dinner that evening at their ranch outside Bozeman. Ethan immediately tried to refuse, insisting that helping with a trailer was hardly worth such a fuss, but Frank was persistent in a gentle, almost fatherly way that made it difficult to argue. Lily, who had been listening from the garage doorway with undisguised curiosity, whispered loudly enough for both men to hear, "Dad, you never get invited to fancy ranch dinners." Caroline laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound softened something in her otherwise guarded expression. Looking from his daughter's hopeful face to the veteran's expectant smile, Ethan finally agreed, though as the SUV pulled away a few minutes later, he stood in the middle of his grease-stained garage with the uneasy feeling that a single rainy afternoon had just opened the door to a world he had never intended to step into. That evening Ethan borrowed a clean sport coat from his neighbor, spent 20 minutes trying to tame Lily's hair into something she considered ranch dinner worthy, and drove west as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of orange and rose. The Bennett Ranch sat at the end of a long cottonwood-lined road that wound through rolling fields dotted with grazing horses, and when the main house came into view, Ethan felt a flicker of disbelief. It was not a flashy mansion but a sprawling timber and stone home built with the quiet confidence of old money, its wide porch glowing with warm light against the deepening twilight. Frank greeted them at the door as though they were old friends rather than near strangers, and Lily was immediately charmed by the two enormous golden retrievers that wandered through the entry hall with the casual authority of longtime residents. Caroline appeared a moment later in a simple dark sweater and jeans, looking less like the polished executive who had arrived at the garage that morning and more like someone who belonged to the land surrounding the house. Over dinner, Frank asked Ethan about the repair shop, about Lily's school, about the small routines of their life together, and Ethan answered honestly, speaking with the same straightforwardness that had led him to help a stranger in the rain. Caroline listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that felt less like polite conversation and more like an attempt to understand the man behind the grease-stained work shirts and quiet demeanor. When Frank stepped away midway through the meal to take a phone call, an unexpected silence settled between Ethan and Caroline. She broke it by asking what he had done before opening the garage, explaining that most mechanics she knew did not speak with the kind of precision he had used earlier when discussing trailer supports and weight distribution. Ethan hesitated for a moment before admitting that he had once worked as a civil engineer for a large construction firm in Denver, designing load-bearing structures and overseeing safety inspections on commercial projects. Caroline's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "That's a long way from replacing brake pads in a small-town garage," she said. Ethan smiled faintly and explained that after Rachel died, the long hours, constant travel, and corporate politics had stopped feeling important. He had wanted a life where he could be home for dinner, attend Lily's school events, and sleep at night without worrying that someone above him might ignore a safety concern to protect a quarterly profit report. Caroline was quiet for a long moment after that, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost much of its earlier caution. She admitted that she spent most of her days fighting those exact battles inside Bennett Logistics, pushing back against investors who cared more about expansion numbers than the drivers and warehouse workers who kept the company running. The conversation shifted then, becoming unexpectedly easy. They talked about books, about Montana winters, about the strange loneliness that can exist even in a life filled with responsibilities and people. At one point Lily proudly announced that her father made the best blueberry pancakes in 3 counties, which earned another genuine laugh from Caroline and a mock groan from Ethan. When Frank returned to the table, he paused almost imperceptibly at the doorway, noticing the relaxed smiles and animated conversation unfolding between his daughter and the mechanic he had met in a muddy supply yard less than 24 hours earlier. He said nothing, but the satisfied glint in his eyes suggested that he had hoped for exactly this outcome from the moment he asked Ethan to dinner. Over the next several weeks, Ethan found himself returning to the Bennett ranch more often than he ever expected. Sometimes Frank invited him to look at an old tractor that refused to start, other times Caroline stopped by the garage under the pretense of asking advice about a vintage pickup her father was restoring. The visits gradually became less about vehicles and more about conversation. Lily adored the ranch, spending hours feeding horses and following Frank around the property while he taught her how to identify different birds by their calls. For Ethan, the place became something he had not realized he missed: a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the easy presence of other people. Caroline changed too. At the office she remained the sharp, disciplined chief operations officer who negotiated contracts and managed thousands of employees, but at the garage she relaxed in ways that surprised even her. She would sit on a stool near Ethan's workbench, sipping coffee while he explained the inner workings of an engine, and she laughed freely whenever she tried to help and ended up with grease smudged across her hands. The growing closeness between them did not go unnoticed. Marcus Holloway, Bennett Logistics' ambitious chief financial officer, watched the situation with increasing irritation. Marcus had spent years positioning himself as Frank's most trusted executive, and many within the company assumed he would eventually marry Caroline, merging business influence with family power in a way that would secure his future permanently. To him, Ethan was an unacceptable variable, a small-town mechanic with no business becoming part of the Bennett family's inner circle. Convinced that no one could be as selfless as he appeared, Marcus hired a private investigator to dig into Ethan's past, certain he would uncover debts, lawsuits, or some hidden scandal. What the investigator discovered instead unsettled him. Ethan had indeed been a highly respected engineer, one who had left a lucrative career after refusing to approve a commercial project that failed to meet critical safety standards. Internal documents showed he had argued repeatedly for costly corrections, and when senior executives chose to ignore the risks, he resigned rather than attach his name to the project. The investigator's report contained no evidence of fraud, greed, or opportunism, only a pattern of decisions that consistently placed principle above personal gain. Marcus was furious, but instead of abandoning his suspicions, he decided to create doubt where none existed. Quietly, he began suggesting to board members and local business contacts that Ethan's sudden friendship with the Bennett family was too convenient to be accidental. Rumors spread quickly through Bozeman's small business community. People whispered that the widowed mechanic had cleverly inserted himself into the path of a wealthy veteran, that his engineering background proved he was far more calculating than he appeared, and that his growing closeness to Caroline was part of a long-term plan to secure financial security for himself and Lily. Ethan noticed the change almost immediately. Customers who had once chatted easily now seemed oddly reserved, and one afternoon he overheard 2 men in the diner speculating about how long it would be before he'd moved into the ranch for good. The gossip hurt more than he expected, not because he feared losing money or status, but because it threatened the fragile trust that had been growing between him and Caroline. When she arrived at the garage the following Saturday, he sensed a new tension in her expression, the unmistakable sign that the rumors had reached her as well. Rather than force her to choose between him and the company pressure surrounding her, Ethan quietly stepped back. He stopped accepting dinner invitations from Frank, limited his conversations with Caroline to brief, practical exchanges, and buried himself in work. Watching her drive away that afternoon, he told himself he was protecting her from a storm he had never intended to bring into her life, even as the empty silence left behind in the garage felt far lonelier than it had before she entered it. 3 weeks later, Frank Bennett called an emergency meeting of the Bennett Logistics Board, gathering executives, investors, and senior managers in the company's headquarters overlooking the Gallatin Valley. The rumors surrounding Ethan had grown loud enough to threaten both the company's reputation and Caroline's authority, and Frank had decided he was finished allowing gossip to speak louder than facts. Without offering any explanation, he dimmed the lights and played security footage retrieved from the farm supply yard. The grainy video showed the entire rainy afternoon exactly as it had happened: an elderly man struggling alone beside a broken trailer, a dozen bystanders watching without helping, and one stranger setting down his own purchases and walking into the mud without hesitation. The footage continued for nearly 40 minutes, showing Ethan working steadily beside Frank, refusing payment, and driving away without ever learning who he had helped. When the lights came back on, the room was silent. Frank looked directly at the board members who had repeated the rumors and said quietly, "A man's character is revealed most clearly when he believes no one important is watching." The effect was immediate. Several executives lowered their eyes, and Marcus Holloway's confident expression finally cracked. Before he could recover, Caroline stood and revealed something even more damaging. During a recent internal review prompted by Ethan's engineering observations about a fleet maintenance contract, auditors had discovered that Marcus had approved substandard replacement parts for hundreds of company trailers in order to reduce costs and inflate quarterly performance numbers. The decision had created serious safety risks for drivers across multiple states. Within 48 hours Marcus was suspended, and by the end of the week he had been removed from the company entirely pending a full investigation. That same evening, Caroline drove to Ethan's garage just after closing. She found him alone, wiping down the workbench in the fading light, and before he could speak she apologized for allowing fear and public pressure to create distance between them. Ethan listened quietly, then admitted that he had stepped away because he cared about her too much to become a source of trouble in her life. The honesty of that confession broke through the last of Caroline's defenses. She told him she was tired of relationships built on ambition, appearances, and calculations, and that the only person who had consistently made her feel safe rather than evaluated was the mechanic who had walked into the rain to help a stranger. Ethan reached for her hand, and for the first time since Rachel's death, he allowed himself to believe that loving someone again did not betray the life he had lost. It honored the part of him that was still capable of hope. A year later, little had changed on the surface and everything had changed underneath. Ethan still ran Cole Auto Repair, still spent his mornings fixing engines and his evenings making blueberry pancakes for Lily, who now referred to Frank as Grandpa Frank with complete certainty. Caroline remained at Bennett Logistics, but she spent most weekends at the garage or helping Ethan and Lily restore old vehicles in the small barn behind his house. Together they had created a community program that provided free repairs for elderly veterans and widows who could not afford essential vehicle maintenance, and local mechanics had begun volunteering their time to support it. One crisp autumn evening, the three of them stood outside the garage watching Lily and Frank argue cheerfully over the proper way to polish a truck bumper. Caroline slipped her hand into Ethan's and smiled as golden leaves drifted across the street. Neither wealth nor status had brought them together. It had started with a broken trailer, a rainy afternoon, and one ordinary act of kindness offered with no expectation of reward. From that single unremarkable decision, a new family had quietly been built, proving that the smallest moments of compassion are often the ones powerful enough to change the course of an entire life.